Mom said, "You're just jealous of your sister. You'll never succeed like her." I laughed and said, "Good. Then she can pay your bills." An hour later, you know that feeling when you walk into a room and immediately realize you don't belong? That's been my entire life in my own family. My sister, Allison, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Meanwhile, I was the afterthought, the inconvenience, the black sheep. My mother made sure I knew it, too. It didn't matter what I did. I was never enough. I got into a great college. She barely reacted. Landed a decent job. She asked why I wasn't earning more. But when Allison baked a mediocre cake for some office party, you'd think she had one top chef. It wasn't just frustrating. It was soul-crushing. Imagine working your entire life for validation that will never come. I was always the one they forgot to include. At family gatherings, my mother would introduce Allison with pride, listing all of her so-called accomplishments. Then she'd turn to me and shrug, as if she wasn't sure what to say. Even when I had something to celebrate, she found a way to diminish it. It was always, "Well, that's nice," in a flat voice, before she'd steer the conversation back to Allison. The worst part? Allison never corrected her. She soaked up every bit of praise, every proud smile, every brag at family gatherings. She knew our mother played favorites, and she enjoyed it. She wasn't outwardly cruel, but she never once stood up for me. To her, this was just the natural order of things. And to be honest, for a long time I believed it too. I thought maybe I deserved to be second place. But resentment is a slow-burning fire, and mine had been smoldering for years. I told myself that one day things would change, that maybe, if I worked hard enough, my mother would finally look at me with the same pride she gave Allison so effortlessly. But deep down, I knew better. Some battles are lost before they even begin, and in my family, my role had already been decided for me. The funny thing is, when you spend your whole life being overlooked, you start looking for ways to stand out. But not for them, for yourself. I was done chasing approval that would never come. Done with the unspoken rule that Allison was the sun and I was just some distant, forgettable star. They had pushed me aside for too long, assuming I'd always be there, waiting. But people like me don't just disappear, we evolve. The moment I stopped caring about their validation was the moment I realized I had all the power. I just didn't know it yet. And when you upset the balance of a family built on favoritism, things tend to fall apart in ways no one expects. For someone who never saw me as successful, my mother sure had no problem depending on me financially. It started small, just a little help with groceries, an occasional bill here and there. But over the years, it became an expectation. She never asked Allison for money, of course. That would mean acknowledging that her perfect daughter wasn't as untouchable as she seemed. No, it was always me, the lesser child, but somehow the one responsible for keeping things afloat. I didn't mind at first. I had convinced myself that it was just part of being a good son. But the more I gave, the more she took. It wasn't just about necessities anymore. It was about comfort. "Oh, I need help with the mortgage this month," became, "Can you cover my car payment?" Then, "Wouldn't it be nice if I had some extra spending money?" It was never ending. I was treated like an ATM, not a person. What really got me was the entitlement. She never said thank you, not once. It was as if my financial help was something she deserved simply because she was my mother. She'd guilt-trip me if I hesitated, throwing around phrases like, "Family takes care of each other," or, "This is just what children do." But when I needed support, emotionally or otherwise, where was she? Nowhere. I was good enough to fund her lifestyle, but not good enough to be valued. Then came the breaking point. One night, she called me, voice dripping with fake sweetness, and asked for another small favor. She needed help covering her mortgage again. This time I said no. I was tired of being used. I expected her to be upset, maybe even a little disappointed, but her reaction shocked me. She didn't just get angry. She acted like I had betrayed her, like I was some ungrateful, selfish monster for refusing to keep playing my role. And that's when it hit me. She didn't love me, at least not in the way a parent should love their child. She loved what I could provide. The moment I stopped being useful, I became the villain. It hurt, but it was freeing too. I had spent years bending over backward for her approval, only to realize she never truly saw me as anything more than a safety net. That realization burned away any lingering guilt I had. Still, she wasn't done yet. If I wasn't going to bankroll her life, she had another option. Allison. After all, Allison was the successful one, right? The one she had always praised, always uplifted. Surely her golden child would step up when I refused. My mother called her that same night, probably expecting an easy yes. She was in for a surprise. Because here's the thing about golden children. They shine brightest when they don't have to carry any weight. And when that weight suddenly falls on them, they don't always hold up. I don't know exactly what my mother expected when she called Allison that night. Maybe she thought Allison would swoop in like some noble heroine, eager to take on the responsibility I had so selfishly abandoned. After all, wasn't that what golden children did? They were perfect, reliable, everything I supposedly wasn't. But for the first time in her life, Allison was being asked to do something that didn't come with applause. And she didn't like it. I wasn't on the call, but I heard about it later. My mother had barely finished explaining the situation when Allison cut her off. She couldn't help. She had her own expenses, her own priorities. She had just leased a new car, planned a vacation, had credit card bills piling up. I could almost hear the awkward silence on the other end of the line. My mother, for the first time in forever, was speechless. Allison had never said no before. But here's the thing. Allison had never needed to say no before. She had always been protected, shielded from responsibility. While I was being drained dry, she was free to live her life without ever worrying about what it cost. And now, faced with a real sacrifice, she chose herself. I can't say I blame her. It was almost funny, in a twisted way. My mother had spent years building her up, placing her on a pedestal, only for her to step down the second things got hard. Of course, my mother didn't take it well. She tried guilt-tripping her just like she had always done with me. The whole family takes care of each other's speech. The "I've done so much for you" routine. But Allison didn't budge. Maybe she felt bad, maybe she didn't. Either way, she wasn't about to rearrange her life for the woman who had spent decades making her feel untouchable. And just like that, the pedestal cracked. My mother called me afterward, livid. She ranted about how selfish Allison was, how she had raised an ungrateful daughter. I almost laughed at the irony. Suddenly, Allison wasn't the golden child anymore. She wasn't the shining example of success and obedience. She was a disappointment, a letdown. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being blamed. It was a strange feeling, a mix of satisfaction and something else, something closer to pity. Not for my mother, but for Allison. She had spent her whole life basking in admiration, only to realize how conditional it had always been. She was never really loved more than me. She was just more useful, until she wasn't. And now, with no one left to lean on, my mother was about to face something she had never truly experienced before: consequences. Because here's the thing about building your world around control. You never consider what happens when the pieces stop playing along. And this time, neither of us were willing to be pawns anymore. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one scrambling to fix things. I wasn't the backup plan, the safety net, the one expected to sacrifice everything for the sake of family. My mother had always assumed I'd cave, that I'd come crawling back the moment she made me feel guilty enough. But I didn't, and neither did Allison. And that left her with a problem she had never prepared for, figuring things out on her own. It was strange, watching everything shift so quickly. My mother tried to reach out a few more times, each call a little more desperate than the last. She tried different angles. Anger, pity, even pretending nothing had happened. But I didn't fall for it. I wasn't the same person anymore. I had spent years believing I was lesser, that my only value came from what I could give. But the truth was, the moment I stopped giving, I became free. And Allison? She was dealing with her own wake-up call. She had spent her whole life being praised, being treated like she could do no wrong. And now, in our mother's eyes, she was nothing more than a disappointment. The fall from grace was harsh, but I think a part of her understood. Maybe, for the first time, she realized what it had felt like to be me. Or maybe she didn't care. Either way, it didn't matter. We weren't playing by the same rules anymore. Walking away from that toxic cycle wasn't easy. There were moments where I questioned myself, moments where the guilt tried to creep back in. But then I'd remember all the years I spent feeling invisible. All the times I bent over backward for a woman who never once acknowledged my worth. And I realized I didn't owe her anything. Not my money, not my time, not my energy. Cutting ties wasn't just an act of self-preservation. It was the first real choice I had ever made for myself. I don't know exactly what happened to my mother after that. She probably found someone else to latch onto, someone else to manipulate. That's just who she is. As for Allison, we haven't talked much since everything went down. Maybe she resents me for standing my ground. Maybe she respects me for it. Either way, I'm done trying to win a game that was rigged from the start. My life isn't about them anymore. It never should have been. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that family isn't just about blood. It's about respect. It's about effort. And if those things aren't there, then walking away isn't selfish, it's survival. I spent years believing that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved myself, I'd finally be seen. But the truth is, I was always worth more than they made me feel. And now I finally get to live like it, because at the end of the day, the best revenge isn't anger or resentment. It's moving on. And trust me, I've never felt lighter.